Hello, welcome back to CST 3130. So in this lecture I'm going to explain how we can use TypeScript to download data from web services. So I'm going to start with a short introduction, and then I'm going to cover environment variables. So when you're using commercial web services, they often have different kinds of plans, and you often have to authenticate yourself with the web service, often using an API key or something similar to that. And so I'll explain how you can actually store your API keys in environment variables and use them in Node. Then I'm going to give a couple of examples of how you can download numerical data through an example based on Forex or currency exchange. And I'm going to show you how you can download news headlines, to give you a text data example as well. Okay, so last time you did web scraping, and as you found, web scraping is a bit tricky and fiddly because websites are not designed to let you download data from them. And so you have to sort of mess around doing various kinds of CSS selectors, and then if they change the design of the website, then that can just break your code, and then you've got to rewrite all your code for scraping the data from that particular website. Web scraping is banned, right? We had that whole fiddly process of looking at robots' text to see whether we could take data from that website or not. And there's also the added complication that a lot of modern websites use frameworks like Angular and Vue to load data from a web service and then insert it into the page. And so you have to mess around with a headless browser and all this kind of thing as well, And sometimes they have various timeouts or they just block you. It's kind of a messy, complicated business to get data from web scraping. But what we're going to explore this term instead is data from web services, And so what a lot of people and companies do is they make data that's available for other people to use through web services. So there's usually consistent formatting. They'll often have versioning, so they might have one web service that delivers data, certain amounts of data in one format, and then if they change the format or change the data available, they'll have a different path with like V2 or something like that. So that legacy code will still work with the earlier web service, but later versions, can use the more modern web service. If a good web service have a comprehensive documentation about the paths, query parameters, authentication, and the structure of the data downloaded. Most of them that I've come across anyway are RESTful, right? So you use get, post, put, delete to access the data in JSON format. Older ones used to be XML. There's some ones probably use GraphQL, I think it's called, where you have like a JSON formatted query language. But the ones I'm going to cover here at any rate are pretty straightforward. We've got get, post, put, delete, or mostly get in this case, and then manipulating the path and query parameters to get different kinds of data. Commercial web services, there's quite a few of them providing things like financial data. These often have a free tier access. You sign up, you get a free API key, and then you have often limited functionality on the free plan. So you might have a certain number of requests or certain types of data be available on the free plan. And then obviously if you pay more, you can get the full data if you wanted it. But there's plenty of, for the purposes of coursework 2, there are plenty of ones with a usable free plan out there for this that you can use in your projects. So if we're talking about numerical data, here's a few examples. I'm going to use Alpha Vantage for the example in this lecture. We can get weather data, we can get football data. This is just a small sample of the kinds of data we can get from web services kind of for numerical data. There's plenty, and so this example, slightly older example of ixtrading.com, right? So you can see here we've got the path, it's version 1 of the API here, and we're using the path and query parameters to specify the kind of data we want. And here's the data in a kind of unformatted form. So there's a Chrome plugin, by the way, that will let you format the data, JSON formatted data nicely in the browser. And you might want to use something like that to make your life a little easier when you're trying to unpick these very complicated JSON files, it can be a little fiddly, For text data, there's plenty as well. Used to use Twitter on this module, but Twitter's no longer has a free plan that lets you get data. So we sort of moved on from that to news APIs, my current favorite, I think. Guardian API, students have used in the past. I've never played around with Reddit, but it also has an API there. I'm not quite sure what the free key sort of stuff is there. And also Alpha Vantage, as it happens, also has text data that you can also download from there, as well as the numerical data if you want to. But I'm going to focus on News API in this lecture. So here's the News API web service. Again, you see you've got the sort of base URL here. We've got the versioning going on, and then we can use the query parameters and supply the API key, and then we can then download news headlines and search for news headlines on a particular topic. And that's what I'm going to cover later. So the ways of accessing these web services varies a little bit. HTTP is kind of the standard one, or HTTPS. So, standard get and put, stuff you should know already, yeah? But some of these web services are also wrapped up within a Node module, yeah? And so the News API example I'm going to use, there's a dedicated Node module someone's written that lets you just use more sort of object-oriented code to pull data from the API, and you don't have to mess around with an HTTP client then, yeah? Some of them are sort of more financial-oriented ones will also provide sort of live feeds of WebSockets, but I'm going to focus just on these two for this module. Yeah, if you want to use WebSocket version, that's totally fine too. Yeah. Now, some of these web services just let you use them for free kind of thing, and there's no authentication. So there used to be a government one that provided coronavirus data for the UK that you could just ping, use for free, you didn't have to authenticate yourself. Other ones, particularly the more commercial ones, you need to authenticate yourself and sign up for a free plan. And in that case, typically there's an API key that's just a URL query parameter, yeah? But sometimes that the API key might go as one of the headers that you send to the service, yeah? More complicated ones, particularly where it's more sort of sensitive, like Facebook or Twitter, as it used to be, we use what's called OAuth, which I don't fully understand, but it's more complicated, and I think you have an authentication server in the loop as well. And for these kind of more complicated ones, it's probably easier to use a Node library to handle that authentication rather than trying to handle it all yourself by pinging, the web service and pinging, the authentication server and all that. Yeah, I'm just going to focus in this lecture on simple ones that use an API key. So also too, this data is quite important, yeah? So you really need to get some, and you need to do what I ask you to do with it, or you're not going to get many marks, yeah? So there's marks for downloading numerical and text data from the web services and storing it in DynamoDB. All that code for that can just run locally because we're going to use TypeScript for that, and I'm not going to get you to do infrastructure as code. It's not one of the requirements. It's something you might want to do, but it's not one of the requirements, yeah? So local code written in TypeScript will download the numerical and text data and upload it to the cloud. I'm only going to show you the download part here. The upload stuff, you'll have to look at the DynamoDB lecture for that. Yeah. Then you're going to, for the numerical data, you're going to train up a model in SageMaker and generate predictions about future values of the numerical data. You're going to run the text data through a sentiment analysis to see whether people are saying good or bad things about it. And then you're going to do visualization of this data on your front end. You're going to plot the numerical data, plot the predictions about numerical data, and plot the results of sentiment analysis. Yeah. So the data is the sort of key sort of thread running through this coursework. So you really need to get some, and that's what this lecture is all about. Yeah. So before we move on to the downloading of the data, I want to say a little bit about environment variables. Yeah. So as I've explained, the sort of commercial web services in particular require one or more API keys. Yeah. Now, you could put them inside your code, you could just write them inside your code, but then if you're using a public repository like GitHub or something like that, then you might accidentally submit those API keys when you commit the code to the repository. Also, when you submit your coursework, you submit the coursework to me, right? And then the external examiner is going to look at it. All these people, you're going to have a sort of chain of people who are going to look at those keys, and potentially, that not so bad if it's a News API key, quite bad if it's maybe a Twitter key, because if I got hold of your Twitter key, or X key as it's called now, I could then also post tweets in your name and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so you want to take care of API keys, that's for sure, yeah? And one way of doing this is to store the keys as environment variables, yeah? And environment variables are sort of in the context that the program is executing, and it can just access those variables. So quite a lot of you will have already played around with the path environment variable, which the operating system used to look for executable programs. But there's lots of other environment variables holding information about the JDK, for example, if we're using Maven, the user, and so on. Yeah. So what we can do is we can take those API keys, put them into environment variables, and then we're much less likely to copy them to commit them to a repository or something like that. Yeah. So these, I just sort of echoed them here in the shell, yeah, and you can see these are all the environment variables within the Windows PowerShell environment, and each environment has different environment variables, yeah. When you're working in the cloud, you can set environment variables in AWS Lambda. And so there's different ways of setting these things, yeah. So if you're using the window control panel, which I would typically use if I was setting up my path in Windows, yeah, I might use that to do that. Probably a similar way to do that on a Mac, or I think it's bash RC, something like that, yeah. On the command line, we can actually set those environment variables sort of manually, like by typing them out and setting them, prior to launching the application. Sometimes you can do that sort of within the IDE as well. Yeah, they can actually set the environment variables for the application that they're running. Yeah. Nice way of doing this in Node is to use a file called .env. Yeah. So what we do is we put the environment variables inside a file called .env, and then we use there's a Node.js library called, or module called .env that will take those variables in .env and copy them into environment variables. And then Node has this process object that contains those environment variables. Yeah. So this makes it much nicer because we put them all in .env file. Then we can prevent that .env file from being committed to the repository, right? You can just not commit anything that starts with a dot, and then your files are all your API keys are safe on your local machine, and they won't be seen by everyone, and you don't have to submit them with your code when you hand in your code at the end of this term. Yeah. So here's a .env file. I've got a sort of fake sort of my environment variable here. And then here's how we actually load it into the environment. Yeah. So we need the .env library. Obviously these days we could use import, slightly old example. And then if we just log out process.env.myEnvironment variable, at the moment it's undefined, yeah, because we haven't set that variable within our local environment. And then we have this .env config, and all that does is load up the environment variables from .env and then copies them into the environment that the program is executing, which we can access to this process env object. Yeah. And then once we've set it here, then process.env will contain that environment variable, and then we can use it also in our code. Yeah. Okay, so put your API keys in a .env file, so keep them safe that way, and then that's the approach we're going to be using with these two examples. So we're going to start with a currency exchange, or Forex as it's called, like foreign exchange is what it's sort of some kind of combination thing. So I'm just going to use this as an example, but you can use exactly the same code, or not exactly the same code, but similar code to download data from any of these web servers. Yeah. Now, because in this example, we're going to be using just the standard HTTP method of pinging the web service. And so if we want to send HTTP messages to a web service, we need an HTTP client, right? This is Node, it's not running in the browser. So we need a separate HTTP client. And the one I tend to use is Axios, but there's probably a few others out there, yeah? This example, as I said, is based on AlphaVantage, but you can easily adapt it for other web services. So just to introduce AlphaVantage, I'm not saying this is the best one or whatever, it's just the one I happen to quite like at the moment, but these things change every year. So you've got the URL there. It's got some very nice documentation that clearly explains it with some kind of examples. AlphaVantage is great because there's lots of different types of financial data, right? You've got, it's got Forex, it's got cryptos, it's got commodities like, iron, tin, and all this kind of stuff. It's also got stocks and shares, and it's even got text data for sentiment analysis, yeah? So what you need to do is you can sign up for a free API key, and that API key will give you 25 calls per day. Yeah, so you can ping the AlphaVantage API 25 times in a day. That might not sound like much, but the nice thing about AlphaVantage is it's very straightforward to get lots of data with a single API call. Yeah, so as I'll show you when I do the demo, we can actually get 5,000 pieces of Forex data with one call. So 25 calls per day is actually more than you're actually going to need in order to download all the data for your project, at once. Yeah. So it has very nice documentation, very clear. I would avoid the premium endpoints, but the sort of trending and other ones you can access with a free API key. So with any of these web services, particularly the commercial ones, they're quite complicated, and you need to read the documentation to understand how the query parameters work. Yeah, every single one is pretty much different, right? There's very little in common between them. So you need to look at the documentation, figure out how the URL and path work and the authentication with the API key, and then you can build a URL, ping it either in Postman or the browser, and make sure you're getting the right data, and then it's a good time to start writing the code that does that as well. Yeah. So with AlphaVantage, it has this structure, right? We've got this base URL, which is basically a query. So it's not versioned. I'm not sure how versioning works on this, but anyway. So currently unversioned. And then we have the query parameters are function, which is like FX daily. I can't remember the other ones, but they're all covered in the documentation, right? There'll be ones for crypto and so on and so forth. And then obviously with a Forex, we want the currency the sort of one currency, it's the exchange rate between one currency and another currency. So we've got from symbol to symbol are the currency symbols, and these are probably standard ones, and there'll be some documentation somewhere, probably Wikipedia, yeah? Then we supply the API key, and then it's got one more query parameter, which basically, by default, you'll get about 100 rows of data. If we set output size to full, then we're getting all of the data that AlphaVantage has. It's about 5,000, I think, for Forex, yeah? So it's a good old chunk of data. And so the URLs look a bit like this, and if you look at documentation, they've got some demo ones that you can kind of click on and see how it all works, yeah? So here's the sort of URL here, and here's the sort of example data. And as I said, this is nicely formatted using this Chrome plugin, and so I can choose between raw and parse, and just a bit easier to see if you use the Chrome plugin, yeah? We'll be coming back to that anyway, yeah? So now let's have a look at, so now we understand the web service, yeah? We understand how the query parameters work. Then we can actually write some code that will download that data for us, yeah? And for this coursework, we have to use TypeScript, write the code in TypeScript. Yeah, so this isn't the best quality TypeScript, but it's got some types in it. So, you know, it kind of counts, and I'm using interfaces as well, yeah? Okay, so first thing we need to do is put our API keys in the .m file. So these are obviously not my API keys, but you need to put yours in there. Okay, so, you know, that's that. And then, you know, then we need to get going on downloading the data, yeah? So first thing, we need the HTTP client, that's Axios. So obviously I've already installed this using npm, yeah? And then we're using the .m stuff I explained earlier to copy the API keys into the environment, yeah? Into environment variables. And I also need to, if I'm using TypeScript properly, I need to describe the structure of the data that's going to come back from the web service so that I can access, you know, the different parts of it. And in this case, you know, often we'll see with the news API, we have kind of certain keys that point to certain values. In the case of AlphaVantage, it's all kind of key string kind of thing. And that's just how it works. There's no, but we need to define that if we're going to use that properly in TypeScript, yeah? So this here is defining the structure of this, and as you can see here, the structure is we've got a string key here, time series fx daily, and that's pointing to one or more other this is an object here with a bunch of other keys, where the key is the date and the values are the open, high, low, close kind of thing, yeah? Okay, so firstly, I need to build the URL. Remember, it's an HTTP client, so it needs to ping a URL with a GET request in this case. So we need to define the currencies we want to exchange. Then we got the base URL and the API key, which I explained. And then we've got this option to get all the data instead of just 100 rows. Probably easier to start with, just get 100, make sure it's working. Then when you're downloading the final data, just get the lot. Yeah, probably recommend, yeah. Then we have the currency symbols. Again, you need to look at the API documentation to get those right. Get the URL query parameters right. And then getting the data is really easy once we've got the URL. We just use Axios get, and then it has a data will return the contents of the HTTP response. Yeah. Then I'm calling my own function, process data, to actually extract that data and output it on the command line. So to process the data, I need to understand the structure of what's coming back. Yeah, I need to figure out what the keys are, and then pick out the different keys in order to be able to output. I can't remember which one of these numbers. Yeah, for your purposes, if you're doing Forex, it doesn't really matter whether it's open, high, low, or close, or the average of all of them. It's not important, yeah? Okay, so to extract the data, I need to understand that it has this key pointing to these objects. So, so you can see here with DT and data, time series daily, that'll give us all of that stuff, yeah? And then there'll be, so here I'm using DT in. So DT here is the date time, this date here, that's what DT stands for. So it's all of the keys inside this object. And so this is the first key, this will be the second key, and so on and so forth, yeah? So let's bring that. And then we got when you're uploading data to the cloud, I recommend that you don't use dates, which are a bit fiddly and it's a bit tricky to sort sometimes, particularly because it's only going to do string sorting. So I recommend instead use Unix timestamps. Yeah, that's the number of milliseconds since 1st of January or something 1970. Yeah, so that's a nice number. That's a much better format for encoding your date than just the sort of string date format. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new date object, and then when I output the data, I can just use date get time, which outputs the Unix timestamp. So the exchange rate will be time series data.dt.close, and so there's the two keys, right? So here, so we've got time series daily, the date here, so I should put that there, is here, and then dot close, yeah? So then I'll be able to pick out that number 1.087. And then I'm just logging out the downloaded data here because it's just a download example. But obviously you need to combine this example, if you're using Alpha Vantage, with the code that uploads it to the database. So that's a little demo, yeah? Okay, just check. Okay, that's good. Okay, so here's my exchange rates in TypeScript, yeah. So as usual, I've got the kind of TSC, running in the background, retranspiling this every time. And then here, I think I've got not output size full. So, and that's saved, doesn't it? Yeah, so node, exchange rates, JS. And so here we can see here, it's outputting the timestamp and the exchange rate here and the exchange rate, those different timestamps, yeah? Now that's 100 items of data. And so if I add this to the query, to the URL and save it, then we go back here and do the same thing. And here we got 5,000 item points of data. So that's loads of data, perfect for your projects. So I would just download and upload the lot. Yeah, you don't pay much for data on AWS, so it really won't cost you much to put all that in the cloud, yeah? Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, right? All I have to do now, obviously, is I've got the timestamp, I've got the two currencies, got base rate, other currency, and that's all I need to store, right? So 3 pieces of information. If we're taking the base rate for all of your currencies, the dollar, for example, then I want to store the symbol here, the timestamp, and the number, yeah? Okay, so that's the numerical data. Second half of this lecture, I just want to go through how a text data example. So you've got one way of downloading text data for your projects. Obviously, you could welcome to use a different source of text data, like the Guardian API. There's also Financial Times on, which might be quite good if you're doing something like crypto or forex. So I'm going to use the News API web service, and I could have used the Axios client and just ping the URL, ping the server with a HTTP client. But to sort of mix it up a little bit, I thought I'd use a Node module instead of Axios, yeah? And a lot of web services, a lot of people have written wrappers for web services that lets people use a Node module instead of an HTTP client, yeah? So even Alpha Vantage, I could have used a Node module for that. Someone's written one of those. But in this case, it's also good to be able to just use the HTTP client. That's just as good, really. Okay, so News API is quite nice. It lets you search for news articles that mention certain topics. And so the structure is really easy, right? We just have a base URL. Q equals Bitcoin. That's the query, the search query you want to run against the news articles. And the API key. The only real limitation of News API, I would say, is that it only gives you the headlines, and then I think gives you the URL of the full article, which you'd probably have to scrape. So you can only run sentiment analysis on headlines, but that's kind of okay for this project, yeah? It's got a free plan, 100 requests per day, but so supposing you've got 5 features, like 5 cryptos, that's 5 calls, and you don't have to get the same amount of data for text data. It's totally fine, having 100 pieces of data per feature, per currency, if it is currencies you're doing, yeah? So there's the web page. It's got some nice documentation. It's not hard to use at all. And here's an example of the data, again, formatted using the Chrome plugin. So we got articles and we got the title published out and the full URL, yeah? So, pretty good, right? What we really want to get here then is the title of all the articles on Bitcoin, for example, yeah? So download the data is pretty straightforward. In this case, we're importing the Node module instead of Axios client. So if you can look at the documentation on the NPM website, right? So it tells you how to access it and all the parameters and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, doing the same thing with the environment variables because we need an API key to access News API, and we're also defining the structure of the articles that come back, right? So we have articles that points to an array down here of articles, and each article we have what we want to get are a title and published at keys, yeah? We don't have to specify the entire structure of that document because obviously you've got things like authors, source. We only need to specify the keys that we're going to use in our code. So in this case, this is perfectly satisfactory and we won't get any TypeScript errors. Download data is pretty straightforward, right? We create we import the News API module, and then once we've got that, we can create a new instance of the News API class, and then we can call a method on that, for example, specifying the query, the page size, and the language, yeah? And then we can just log it out, and then this structure of the returning data corresponds to the interfaces that we defined earlier, which obviously corresponds to the structure of the data. So we've got articles, titles, and published out are the keys we want to access in that data structure. Okay, so that's just it. It's not hard, this stuff, right? So, and I'll provide the code anyway. So let's just run it just to show you it's working. And this is news. And here, so you can see here, again, I've converted it to Unix because Unix timestamps are much easier to use when we want to sort and slice the data in the database. So what we've got is Unix time because I converted it to Unix, and then we've got all the titles of the articles, which we can then use in our project in your projects for sentiment analysis. In this case, I've forgotten how many articles that is, but it's kind of enough, right? That's plenty for Bitcoin. I do the same thing for Ethereum and same thing for the other currencies you're doing, or Forex. You do, you know, got British UK pound or something like that, GB pound, GBP or something. Yeah. So depending on your project, obviously you're going to use different queries in your code. Where it's gone, you're going to run different queries here to get the relevant articles to your project. Yeah. Okay, so about wrapped up here, I think, yeah. So this lecture is showing you how to download numerical and text data from web services. Yeah, so web services are a much better way to get this kind of data than web scraping. But obviously we did some web scraping because in many cases there is no web service that provides the data you want to get. Yeah, lots of different web services out there that provide lots of different types of data. You know, you're welcome to use an HTTP client like Axios, which is really easy and straightforward. Or if there's a Node module out there, then sometimes that's more convenient. Yeah, and I wouldn't probably bother much with Node modules unless there's complicated authentication methods, such as the case of Twitter/X. Yeah. With all these things, you need to read the documentation, and then you can easily adapt the examples I'm giving you here to be able to download the data from your particular web service that you've chosen, yeah? Because they all have complicated combinations of paths and query parameters, and that's usually described in documentation, but obviously if you don't read it, you're not going to know it, yeah? So that's about it, I think.